It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
What's up? What's happening? Welcome in Take Command podcast. I'm Craig Hoffman. He is Logan Paulsen. I am coming to you from a top secret location studio in Las Vegas, Nevada, off the strip, Logan.
I know it is like I don't know if you want people knowing, but like that's like just a podcast studio that existed in the building you were in. Just like they put that in for use for people, which is crazy to me. But welcome to 2024. So
they knew that I was coming. But I'll be back on Radio Row later today, talking all things Commanders, obviously. And as we get closer to the Super Bowl on Sunday, I'm sure we'll be talking a lot more about that game itself. If you are a listener to this show, but not the radio show, you might want to dip into the radio show podcast feed, because I did have Dan Quinn on the radio show yesterday, which was great. Talking to DQ about a bunch of different stuff. So definitely check that interview out. But today here on Take Command, we're going to talk about the two main guys that Dan Quinn has hired. Logan and I obviously talked about it a little bit on the radio on Monday, which we then put in this podcast feed. I can't believe that was Monday, by the way. I was like in a different city as a different time. But we talked about it a little bit, but Logan's watched a little bit more tape, so we'll dive into that. And then, as promised, the chunk of today's episode is going to be on the Senior Bowl as we finally get a chance to debrief from Logan's trip to Mobile. But Logan, let's start off with Kliff. You've watched a little bit more of this offense. And I will say quickly on the front end for me, the more I talk to people about Kliff, the more I like the hire. We had Justin Pugh crash the show yesterday, who played for him in Arizona. He really liked him. Various people who have covered the league, worked in the league. Just the more people you talk to about him, and even DQ said he's an elite competitor, which to me says this guy's going to work as hard as he needs to figure it out. Smart guy, but just maybe not a head coach. If that's the case, as an OC, like, that's not our problem in DC, because he's doesn't have to deal with the defense, doesn't have to deal with running a team meeting, any of that stuff. So what do you see, and what more have you been able to find out about Kliff Kingsbury?
Yeah, I mean, I think all the stuff that Dan said in his presser, I think really holds true about a guy who understands kind of the basic tenets of offensive football in the NFL, like how to create space horizontally. He does it a little bit differently than like Kyle does, or Sean, or whoever, even Mike McDaniel to a certain extent. There's a different identity there, but I think he understands how to like manipulate defenses, how to like his passing game stuff is really high level. Just understanding like, hey, if I get in this formation, like this is how they're going to match. This is the weak player. Let's see if we can exploit this matchup, find explosive plays that way. So I think there's a lot of like really high level stuff. I think the thing that I get is the more I watch it and the more I talk to people about him, the thing that I have like reservations about is just like, what's your protection plans? Because he is a pass game guy, and like sometimes he's a quarterback. And he played in the air raid, and like that's where the familiarity comes from. And like the concepts are good. It's just like, what are we going to do from a protection standpoint? If we're going to be 5-on-5 all the time, like what's the plan for that? And I think when you look at last year, like one of the issues that this team had was that they're in 5-on-5 protections a lot. And when you know what kind of protections you're in, and when you don't really drill like the 6-man pros as much, where the back stays in, or you don't give the quarterback some flexibility to kind of change some stuff, teams can be manipulative of that. And I think you saw that in games last year, specifically against the Giants and against the Miami Dolphins. So that's a concern that I have. And also, I think, passing game's great. I think you saw some really good stuff running the football in 2021. But a reservation I do have is like, how committed are you going to be to that? And I don't think it's a coincidence that you look at the teams that are consistently winning football games, the NFL, like they run the football effectively. And again, he doesn't need to be dynamic at it, but you got to be effective. And people say, oh, well, he ran the ball well in 2021. And I say, yes, but a lot of the nuance and a lot of the variation that they had there came from the quarterback position. So are you going to be totally reliant on the quarterback running the football in the design run game? And if so, you need to make sure you get the right guy for that job. And then if that is the case, like how do you make sure that that guy is healthy throughout the year and in a sustainable position to execute down the stretch when you need it? And so those are some concerns that I do have. But again, I think all the things you said are 100% correct. But I can be excited and have reservations at the same time. I'm excited for the hire. He's obviously a smart dude, innovative guy, understands NFL football, all of that. But the two reservations I have are just, how do you kind of mature the offense from a protection and run game standpoint?
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I want to get Pugh back on the show because he's an offensive lineman and could talk about that in detail. Yeah. He literally, it was funny because I was, I saw that he was on Radio Row and I was like, man, I really want to get him on because Justin and I actually went to Syracuse together.
Right.
And obviously he played for Kliff. So I was like, this will be fun. And he was going to go on with Grant. It was his last thing for the day. He's literally getting on a plane after that interview. And then he goes and Grant's got somebody else on, and the producer that's kind of on site working for both shows like literally holds up his iPhone and is like, do you want Pugh for 5 minutes now? And I was like, I was about to go to break, and thank God I didn't toss a break. So I was like, yes. Pugh sits down, and we had like 3 minutes to talk ball. So I will reach back out to the people that were working with Pugh, and we'll see if we can get him on the show to talk about this in more detail. But I did ask him, like, what do you make of, as an O-lineman, like, what did you make of the run game? He's like, I like it a lot, and I think it fits with what you have in Washington. And I said, well, why do you say that? Like, what pieces do you have in mind? And he said, I think Brian Robinson will be fantastic in this run scheme. He's like, he reminds me a lot of James Conner, who had a monster year in 2021. That gap scheme, downhill, like physical runner. Get him vertical and watch him go. And I shouted this out on my radio show the other day, but Mark Bullock did a really good breakdown on his Substack of some of the innovative stuff that he does do in the run game in terms of, whether it's unbalanced lines or pulling, some like power plays where instead of just pulling the guard, he pulls the guard and the tackle. But then I think the question becomes, how does that stuff match up with the pass game? And how does that match up with your play action game? And I don't know that cohesion has existed to a level that I think, like from a principle philosophical level, you and I see as a necessity to have an optimized offense in the NFL.
Yeah, no, and I agree. I think Brian Robinson's going to be great because I think one of the things, like when you watch in the games that I watched, obviously James Conner's a big guy. I think he's like 6'2", 6'2.5", 235 pounds. So big old hoss of a man, runs hard. And one of the things you love about this scheme is that because of the horizontal dispersion you create from a formation standpoint, guys don't have ideal angles to tackle the ball carrier. So when you get those big shoulders and those big backs running downhill and they can read it out, like it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough for guys to have to make some plays. Like there was a clip in the week 9 matchup against San Francisco where they're running like a counter and the corner comes up to fit it. And, corners aren't, in the NFL you have to fit runs, but that's not who you want doing that all the time, especially on a gap scheme counter. And James Conner just runs him over like he's a speed bump. And there's no pursuit there because of how the run is set up. And so, again, I do think there's a lot of innovative stuff there. It's just it's very quarterback centric, and it's counter, it's power, and it's tight zone. So, how do you get to that in as many ways as possible? And one of the ways you said, unbalanced line, different personnels, like put some window dressing on it. But from what I understand, he tends to be a guy that's very innovative from a pass game standpoint, and kind of the run game's an afterthought. I think based on what we've seen around the NFL, especially the last 2 years, like it's got to be kind of a priority. And so I think it can be a priority for him. It's just about, making sure that he sees, like it's so refreshing hearing Dan Quinn talk about his blind spots and things he needs to work on and how the time away made him think that. And so does Kliff kind of have that same student mindset and say, hey, like, this is something I can be better at. We did a good job in 21. We kind of lost it in 2022. Like, how do we get back to make sure we're dominant again in that category? And because at times they were dominant. Like, they ran the football very effectively. And again, there's a lot of stuff there to be excited about. That's just one reservation. I'm like, I want to see kind of like how we're going to talk about this later, but how you watch a prospect's film, you're excited about him. I just want to see more. You go watch him at the Senior Bowl, right? Like, that's kind of what I'm waiting for that final judgment. Yeah.
Yeah, it was interesting. So there's an interview that Kliff did with Sean McVay and Peter Schrager during COVID. At one point, Sean and Peter started a podcast because they were bored. And Kliff was a guest on it. And I'm about halfway through re-listening to it right now. And Kliff talks about how he and Sean both, like, they had commiserated over this, that when you're running the offense, it's really hard to find time to actually do that when you're the head coach because, Kliff is this famous, like, get in at 4 a.m. guy. And he does that so that he can get in and like sit in his office and watch the tape. But he knows by 7, there's something else that he's going to have to do.
Right.
And I think being my hope, and clearly Dan's hope, and every fan listening's hope, is that not having to have the team meeting to plan at 7 a.m. means he can get to some of that stuff that maybe he wasn't able to do fully, and can keep that innovation and kind of that, or prevent the stagnation that's happened in the second half of seasons pretty much his entire career. That said, though, I do think it's funny going back and looking at some of the stuff, because record-wise, he had the same problem at Texas Tech that he did at Arizona. Yeah. Start well, finish poorly. But like a lot of those finish poorly games, it's like, oh, how did he lose? He had Patrick Mahomes, and it's like, yeah, they lost 50-48. Like Mahomes was throwing for 500 yards and they'd still lose because their defense was terrible. And so I do think as an OC, like I get why people are excited. I get why DQ gets them.
Yeah.
And it's ultimately going to come down to that competitiveness trait, and competitiveness being met with humility. Do you do that review and take that elite competitor thing that DQ dropped on me yesterday when talking about Kliff, and have that reflection that Dan did, and have the humility to implement some of those changes? And then it comes down to staff too. Like, who's his O-line coach is going to be a big question to me. And we should mention, by the way, as we record this at 11:45 Eastern on Thursday morning, 8:45 Pacific here in Vegas, about 20 minutes ago, or maybe a little bit longer than that, 40 minutes ago, there's a report from ESPN that Brian Johnson, the former Eagles offensive coordinator, is going to be a part of the staff. What do you make of that as a guy who was a huge part of Jalen Hurts' development, and was one of the hot names, and people thought he might be in the head coaching cycle this year before things went sideways in Philly?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, I don't know that much about him. I do know that he has a reputation for being a very dynamic, energetic coach, and I think that's something that I think Dan Quinn values. And I think getting guys that have had experience with A, teams in the division, and B, young quarterbacks, I think is invaluable. So I think additions like that are great. I think it's also great having guys that have been coordinators. I think it's important to have that kind of global thought. And I think people forget how impactful that staff is in terms of presenting new ideologies to the head coach, or to the coordinator, excuse me. So I think just having a group of guys that are smart football guys they kind of see it the same way. He ran a version, like a spread-ish offense when he was at Florida. They ran a spread-ish offense when he was in Philly. Just kind of finding stuff that works, and having guys that say like, hey, we tried this way when I was in Florida. It worked pretty good. And then Kliff can kind of put that in the mixer and say, oh, this works, this doesn't, whatever. And I just also wanted to point out that, like, while I have those reservations about Kliff, like, I'm extremely excited about the football mind. You know what I'm saying? I'm extremely excited about that.
Oh, yeah.
And I think, and I'm excited to see how they flesh out the staff, because I know, like, a strong staff can help a guy like that just be the best version of himself and help with some of that self-reflection and growth that we were talking about.
Yeah, I think that, he tried to bring the tight ends coach from Dallas, and Dallas blocked it. So there's already some attempts to try to get, because there's the tight ends coach in Dallas trying to bring him in as the O-line coach.
Oh, nice.
And so that got
great,
blocked.
Actually. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's going to be interesting to see where they pull from. Can they get someone to make a lateral move, or is there someone that got blown out on another staff? It's just a part of a mega change that they want to keep. But I think it's important, obviously, to get a bunch of guys that are going to pull in the same direction. They're trying to do that on defense. Obviously, that's why Dan hires Whitt. They tried to get Al Harris to join, and Dallas said no to that. So the staffing battle between the Commanders and the Cowboys is on here. And unfortunately, the Commanders don't have a lot to offer, but we'll see ultimately who they're able to pull in. As Dan said the other day, he's got a few more tricks up his sleeve. One trick that he does have that I don't think has been applied yet is assistant head coach. So that can be a way to pull someone away from somewhere else and offer them a title, and thus a promotion that the incumbent team can't turn down or can't deny. But we'll see ultimately where that goes. Not to short the defense, so we will get to Joe Whitt Jr. more in detail another day. And especially I think as they fill out that staff too. But any initial thoughts that you want to share on Joe Whitt Jr. And what he brings from Dallas?
I'm just extremely excited for the secondary here in Washington. I think they were kind of much maligned last year, but his Joe Whitt's pedigree when it comes to secondaries is like insane. Like when you look at his resume, it's like everywhere he's been, they lead the league in turnovers, they lead the league in interceptions, and it's like for not a year or two, it's for long swaths of time. And so I'm extremely